Usually when you sign a contract for a new piece of enterprise software, it feels pretty much like buying a really expensive digital stapler.
Right. Yeah. It just sits there on your server.
Exactly. It does its one specific job. And, if it breaks, you just call IT to fix the jam. It's totally predictable.
It is, because traditional software is fundamentally binary. I mean, a line of code executes correctly or a bug exists. It doesn't just change its mind overnight.
But then you step into the absolute gold rush of AI adoption that we are living in right now, and suddenly that digital stapler is just gone. You are dealing with something entirely different.
Completely different.
And the pressure to modernize workflows is, it's so intense that people are just rushing the procurement process. The problem is, if you treat an AI contract like a standard software subscription, you are stepping right onto a legal landmine.
Oh, absolutely. It is the definition of a false equivalent. You're trying to use rules built for a static tool to govern a dynamic, evolving system. And that mismatch is exactly where buyers are getting completely taken advantage of.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are focusing entirely on a fascinating 2026 source document titled Contracting with AI Vendors, a practical guide for lawyers. It's written by Colin S. Levy.
It's a great piece, really eye-opening.
It really is. And our goal today is to pull back the curtain on why standard AI vendor contracts are just heavily rigged against the buyer. We're going to break down the exact leverage, the specific clauses, and those hidden traps, the ones you need to know before you sign anything.
Yeah, and this guide really lays out a reality that a lot of enterprise buyers are currently just ignoring. The foundation of the problem is this assumption that AI is just software as a service 2.0.
Which it isn't.
It's not at all. With traditional software, the underlying code is fixed. But AI models produce a different result every single time you run them. And more importantly, they suffer from a mechanical issue known as model drift.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think a lot of people assume that if they test a tool during a pilot phase, right, and it works perfectly, that's the baseline performance they're buying for the next 3 years.
And that assumption right there is exactly what gets companies into so much trouble. Because model drift means the AI's performance profile silently degrades or alters over time.
Silently degrades, wow.
Right. Let's say you buy an AI contract review tool. The day you buy it, it might correctly identify a specific indemnification clause, maybe 95% of the time.
Okay, sounds good.
But as weeks turn into months, the vendor is constantly feeding that model new data. They're adjusting parameters, tweaking the underlying neural network. So 6 months later, because the model's internal geometry has shifted, its accuracy on that exact same clause might drop to 87%.
Wait, and they don't even tell you?
No, the vendor won't send you a warning. It just happens. Yet, buyers are still signing these standard SaaS contracts that just assume the product they test today is exactly the product they'll have tomorrow.
To put that risk in perspective, the industry statistics right now are pretty stark. I mean, according to the source, almost 88% of AI vendors impose liability caps that essentially leave the customer holding the bag if something goes wrong.
88%. It's staggering.
And fewer than 17% offer any sort of regulatory compliance warranty. It really feels like we are trying to use a standard vending machine contract for a completely different entity.
That's a really good way to put it.
Because, standard software is like renting a vending machine. You know exactly what you'll get when you press a button. But AI is more like hiring a highly creative, highly volatile intern.
Right. An intern who might do brilliant work.
Or might randomly decide to hallucinate a law or insult a client. You wouldn't use a vending machine contract to govern a volatile intern.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. And it highlights the critical distinction between the consumer and enterprise tiers of these tools. I mean, the consumer versions of major AI platforms are essentially using user data as the fuel to train their models.
Which is a huge red flag for businesses.
Huge. If a professional uses a free or consumer tier for confidential work, they are committing an immediate professional liability violation.
Because you are literally feeding your client's secrets into the public machine.
Exactly. You need the enterprise tier. But even there, you have to look out for what's called a unilateral modification clause.
What's fascinating here is how vendors use that, right?
What's fascinating here is that in traditional software, if a vendor invokes unilateral modification, it usually just means, they're redesigning the user interface or changing a menu layout without telling you.
Right. Annoying but harmless.
But in an AI contract, vendors try to sneak in the right to change the underlying foundational models. or alter their data processing practices at any time without notice. For an enterprise handling sensitive data, having the underlying cognitive engine of your tool swapped out overnight, it just breaks all your compliance auditing. It's a total non-starter.
Which naturally brings us to the actual fuel that powers this intern. Confidential data. Let's talk about the training data restriction clause, because the guide calls this out as arguably the single most important clause in any AI contract.
It really is. We really need to understand what training on your data actually means in a physical computational sense. The vendor isn't just taking your documents and dropping them into a digital filing cabinet to look at later.
Right. It's not a storage issue.
No. When an AI trains on your data, it is adjusting the internal parameters, the mathematical weights of the model itself. The patterns, the legal strategies, the factual details of your data actually become part of the model's neural network.
Yeah, and there is no undo button for that process, is there?
None whatsoever. You cannot surgically extract one client's data out of a model's weights once it has been baked in. I always say it's like trying to unbake a cake to get your flour back. The structure has fundamentally changed.
And that structural change creates massive privilege risks.
Yeah.
I mean, the American Bar Association issued Formal Opinion 512 back in July 2024, which basically made it clear that just having a generic consent to use technology clause in an engagement letter doesn't cut it anymore.
No, you need specific informed consent.
And there was even a federal court ruling in February 2026 where a lawyer's use of a consumer AI tool literally waived attorney-client privilege.
Because the moment you allow an external model to absorb that information for its own product improvement, the information is no longer confidential, period.
Wow.
And if we look at specific practice areas from the text, the danger becomes very concrete. Like if you are in criminal defense, exposing your strategy to an AI model breaches work product protection.
Right, because it's learning your defense strategies.
Exactly. If you're in family law, it risks spousal privilege and exposes highly sensitive settlement positions. And in healthcare, you are dealing with HIPAA business associate agreements. You simply cannot rely on standard data protection clauses if protected health information is actively being used to adjust a commercial AI model's weights.
But wait, if a vendor just says they're using aggregated or de-identified data for product improvement, isn't that totally standard and safe?
Yeah.
I mean, software companies have been doing that for decades, right?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a very common defense. But the mechanism of how AI learns makes that argument totally fall apart in high-stakes environments. Let's say you are handling high-level mergers and acquisitions or complex litigation.
Okay.
Even if the AI successfully strips out the names of the companies and the individuals, the unique structure of a novel deal or the logical flow of a highly specific legal argument, well, that still gets absorbed as a recognized pattern.
Oh, I see. So the blueprint itself becomes part of the model.
Exactly. And if that vendor also serves your direct competitors or opposing counsel, your brilliant proprietary strategy could subtly influence the output the AI generates for them when they ask it for structural suggestions.
So you are essentially crowdsourcing your own competitive advantage to the other side, just disguised as algorithm optimization.
Precisely. And what makes this even more complex is that the data doesn't just stay with the vendor you signed the contract with. There is a massive mechanical vulnerability known as the subprocessor problem.
Let me guess, the primary vendor isn't actually building everything from scratch.
Rarely. I mean, let's trace a hypothetical API call. You buy a legal research AI from vendor A. You type a highly confidential prompt into their interface. Well, vendor A might be using OpenAI's models as their foundational cognitive engine, so your prompt travels via API to OpenAI.
And then OpenAI has their own servers.
Right, OpenAI might be hosted on Microsoft Azure's cloud infrastructure, and maybe a completely different third-party company is contracted to store the vector database. Your data is flowing through all of them.
So if my contract only has a clause stopping vendor A from training on my data, but I fail to restrict all those downstream subprocessors, the data is still leaking into those underlying foundational models.
Exactly. Because vendor A technically didn't train on it, their subprocessor did. You have to ensure the restriction flows all the way down the tech stack.
Okay, so we've established how the data gets absorbed. But because that data is powering a dynamic, volatile system, we have to look at what happens when the system generates bad output. We are moving from data theft to liability evasion. Let's look at hallucinations.
Yeah, this is where standard SaaS contracts completely detach from reality. To give you a sense of scale, a 2024 Stanford HAI study measured hallucination rates in premium legal AI tools.
Premium tools, not just the free stuff.
Right. And they found that on complex legal tasks, these tools were hallucinating fabricating citations or misinterpreting case law about 17% of the time for Lexis Plus AI and 33% of the time for Westlaw AI.
33%. That means 1 out of every 3 complex arguments it generates could be structurally unsound.
Yes. These are not edge cases, you know. This is baseline performance in the current generation of models. And the liability implications go far beyond just looking foolish in court. Consider the liability for algorithmic bias.
Right.
There was a major case, Mobley v. Workday, which achieved preliminary collective certification in May 2025. This involved an AI screening tool that processed over 1 billion job applications.
Oh, 1 billion.
Yeah, and the plaintiffs alleged the system had a disparate impact, systematically screening out protected groups.
And the key detail there is that the vendor was sued directly, right? Like, the court allowed the claim to proceed against the AI vendor itself, not just the employer who bought the tool.
Correct. The vendor who designed the algorithm was on the hook. And yet, despite these massive structural risks discrimination lawsuits, fabricating case law that leads to Rule 11 sanctions, or even IP infringement lawsuits where a model plagiarizes copyrighted training data, vendors aggressively try to cap their liability. The standard cap in these contracts is usually limited to 12 months of software fees.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So if my enterprise pays $5,000 a month for the tool, the vendor's total liability is capped at $60,000.
Exactly. Which is a rounding error when you're facing a multi-million-dollar class action for disparate impact or, massive copyright litigation like the Getty Images or New York Times lawsuits.
It's like a chef serving you a poisoned meal and saying, hey, read the receipt. My liability is capped at the $50 you paid for the steak. I mean, if the vendor built the neural network and the vendor chose the training data that made the model biased or prone to hallucinations, why am I solely responsible for the hallucinated output?
The short answer is because buyers have been letting them. But you don't have to accept it. The structural fix here is to negotiate a super cap or demand strict, explicit carve-outs.
A super cap.
Yeah. You can leave the standard 12-month fee cap in place for normal service interruptions, like the server going down for an hour. But you demand that the cap does not apply to claims arising from AI-specific failures, hallucinations, discriminatory outputs, or IP infringement. For those categories, the liability needs to be tied to a multiplier of 2 to 3 times the general cap, or completely uncapped.
Because the vendor refuses to take liability for the outputs, that basically forces us to mathematically define what a failure actually looks like. And that leads to the service level agreement, the SLA.
Right. Traditional SLAs just promise that the software will be online 99% of the time. But AI needs an SLA based on output quality. You have to write in a strict hallucination rate threshold, for instance, demanding a maximum 5% hallucination rate. And you tie that to escalating financial penalties that actually hurt the vendor's bottom line.
Wait, hold on. A 99% uptime SLA is easy to prove. The server is either on or it's not. But how on earth do you enforce a 5% hallucination rate? A vendor is never going to just take my word that their AI made a mistake on a complex query.
It requires setting up a baseline testing protocol. You establish a set of standardized, highly complex benchmark prompts during the pilot phase. You then contractually require the vendor to run those benchmark prompts at regular intervals, say weekly, and provide a verified audit of the accuracy. If the accuracy drops below the threshold, it triggers the SLA penalties.
I see. So you're building a controlled environment to prove the degradation, and those penalties operate on an escalating tier system.
Yes. Tier 1, if they miss the threshold slightly, the buyer receives a 10% credit on their invoice. Tier 2. If performance drops further, say 3 to 5 points below the threshold, the credit increases to 25%. And crucially, the vendor is contractually obligated to provide a remediation plan detailing exactly how they will fix the model drift.
Oh, so they have to explain how they'll fix it.
Yes. And Tier 3, if it's a severe degradation, you get a 50% credit and the right to terminate the contract entirely without penalty. Furthermore, you require them to actively monitor for that model drift, mandating that they detect and report performance degradation to you within 24 hours.
But speaking of termination, getting out of an AI contract is vastly more complicated than traditional software. If you cancel a SaaS subscription, you just stop logging in. But with AI, extracting your organization is a massive mechanical operation. You aren't just downloading a CSV file of your data. You have embeddings, vector databases, and custom models that were fine-tuned specifically on your company's workflows.
This is a massive trap known as AI lock-in. To understand why it's so difficult, we have to look at what a vector database actually is. It's not just a text file. It's your proprietary documents turned into multidimensional mathematical coordinates so the AI can understand them. If a vendor stores those coordinates exclusively on their infrastructure in a proprietary format that you cannot export, you are effectively held hostage. If you leave, you have to pay the next vendor to reprocess and re-embed terabytes of raw data from scratch.
So how do you ensure you can actually leave with your infrastructure intact?
You look to emerging regulations. The EU Data Act, which takes effect in September 2025, specifically targets this. It mandates data portability and requires vendors to complete switching activities, meaning they must allow you to extract all your data, embeddings, and artifacts within a 30-day window. You need to write that 30-day unwinding process directly into your termination clause.
So what does this all mean for the little guy? Can a solo practitioner or a small firm actually demand these massive structural changes? Or is this just a fantasy for Fortune 500 companies? Like, are they just going to be handed a take it or leave it PDF?
Even smaller players have strategic leverage. It's just about how you deploy it. First, solo practitioners can aggregate their leverage through bar associations or trade groups. Second, you can cite the open source bond terms AI standard clauses.
Bond terms?
Yeah, they are recognized market-tested norms. If a vendor refuses them, you aren't making a wild customized demand. You're pointing out they are failing to meet the accepted industry standard.
You're establishing that their contract is the outlier.
Exactly. And most powerfully, professionals can use their ethical obligations as an unshakable factual barrier. You inform the vendor, my ethical obligations legally prevent me from allowing you to train on client data. If you can't carve that out, I simply cannot purchase your product. That shifts the dynamic from a business negotiation to a strict legal compliance issue.
But even if you use that leverage and negotiate the perfect contract, there are invisible external forces that can still completely blindside you. We have to look at the leverage of the broader market, the shifting regulatory landscape, and an issue regarding insurance that is genuinely surprising. Let's start with negotiation leverage.
Right now, the market is heavily in the buyer's favor. You can and should play competitors against each other using their public commitments. For example, Microsoft offers a Copilot copyright commitment, which publicly indemnifies users against IP infringement.
Right, they take the hit.
Yep. And Google Gemini Enterprise offers strict data residency controls to keep data localized. You use those as weapons to force a vendor's hand. You tell vendor A, Microsoft covers my IP risk and Google guarantees my data stays local. Why should I sign your contract when you refuse to do either? And additionally, always demand a 90 to 180-day pilot program to gather your own baseline data.
And while you're gathering that data, the regulatory wave is fundamentally changing the rules.
Absolutely. Vendors will actively try to shift the compliance burden to you, the buyer. The EU AI Act introduces strict rules for high-risk systems starting in August 2026. But look domestically at the Colorado AI Act, which takes effect in June 2026. It requires developers to use reasonable care to protect against algorithmic discrimination.
And if your contract shifts that compliance burden entirely onto you, you are suddenly legally responsible for producing testing data that you don't even own.
Exactly. You must ensure the contract explicitly prevents the vendor from shifting those regulatory liabilities onto your plate.
Which brings me to the insurance issue. Wait. So I could negotiate perfectly, follow the law, but if an AI hallucinates, my own malpractice insurance might just ghost me.
This raises an important question, and yes, it's a critical vulnerability known as the silent coverage gap. Your existing professional liability or cyber insurance policy likely does not cover AI-specific failures. Seriously. Standard cyber policies are designed to cover data breaches. They are not designed to cover a scenario where an AI is functioning exactly as programmed, but happens to produce disastrous, hallucinated output. Your insurance carrier might deny the claim because they've quietly added an AI exclusion to your renewal policy.
So you could be paying premiums for years, and the moment the AI makes a mistake, you're on your own. How do we protect against that?
You force the vendor to bridge that gap. You tie the vendor's contractual liability cap directly to their insurance coverage limits.
So instead of their liability being capped at the $60,000 you paid in software fees.
It is capped at their $5 million errors and omissions policy limit. It completely aligns their incentives. If they want to limit their corporate risk, they have to purchase a larger insurance policy, rather than forcing you to absorb the cost of their model's mistakes.
Pulling all of this together, navigating these contracts really requires a complete shift in perspective. Right now, AI vendors are absolutely desperate for enterprise clients, particularly in heavily regulated industries.
Which means the buyer has the leverage. The strongest negotiation position any enterprise will ever have is the willingness to simply walk away. If a vendor refuses to protect your data, refuses to mathematically cap hallucinations, there is always another vendor who will.
We really aren't buying digital staplers anymore. We are integrating unpredictable intelligence into our businesses.
Exactly. You are establishing governance for a cognitive engine.
Which leaves me with one final thought to mull over. We are talking today about human procurement teams negotiating these contracts. But as these models advance, we're rapidly approaching a reality where AI agents won't just be drafting these agreements, they will be negotiating them autonomously against other AI agents in real time.
Oh, wow. That's a wild thought.
Right. When my AI procures a service from your AI, and neither party has a human in the loop at the exact moment the agreement is finalized, how will standard liability caps, or even the fundamental legal concept of a meeting of the minds, apply? It's a fascinating structural puzzle to think about the next time your AI suggests a contract edit. For now, monitor the drift, demand the super cap, and keep your data out of the training weights. Catch you on the next deep dive.